What's going on, San Antonio Spurs fans? We're back with the second part of the Southwest Division Preview Series. I've got a very special guest again. Joining me today is site manager of Grizzly Bear Blues, Joe Mullinax. How are you doing today, Joe?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. It's an exciting time. It's a weird time. You know, it feels like the season just ended, but of course, everything that happened, we don't need to rehash it. The longest season in NBA history ended, and the league is trying to get as much money out of this upcoming campaign as possible, understandably so. And it feels like with the country on fire with
Yeah.
COVID. It seems like the last thing we should be doing is talking about basketball, but I'm grateful for it. It's an opportunity to try to latch on to something that was normal once upon a time, and hopefully will be again.
Yeah, it gives us some positivity, something to hope for. Basketball fans are excited for basketball. I'm sure you're excited for basketball. And like you said,
Sure.
longest season ever, but now we're in the shortest off season I think we've ever seen in any major North American sport. So it's been absolutely crazy. And we'll just hop right into the topic. So the first topic I want to talk to you about is the Grizzlies and their off-season moves. So they didn't really do all that much, but they did add some key pieces through the draft. They did add Mario Hezonja. And so let's go ahead and start off with Mario Hezonja. Is he somebody who you think that is going to add a dynamic to this team or even play a lot for this team? Or is he someone you kind
No,
of see on the back burner?
he's not even going to be on the back burner. He's going to be waived in the days ahead. Chris Harrington of the Daily Memphian, one of the lead Memphis Grizzlies writers down here, reported that Hizonja and Marco Guduric aren't even reporting for camp. So they're both going to be released here in the coming days. Uh, bringing in Guduric, or excuse me, bringing in Hizonja was pretty much a favor to make the trade work. It sounds
Sure.
like they really wanted Desmond Bain, and Bain was the ends, and uh, Mario was the means, so to speak. So he isn't going to be a part of the process. I'm sure the Grizzlies wish him well. Memphis has the ability to just outright waive both of them. They're on expiring contracts, both players. So his own just not going to be a part of the Grizzlies' plans. But you mentioned how they didn't do much in free agency. They targeted their own guys, right?
Yeah.
And Dylan Brooks, in his media availability today, talked about how for the first time in his Grizzlies career, there hasn't been massive overturn. There hasn't been, a massive draft pick or a big trade of Marc Gasol or Mike Conley or,
Sure.
for the first time, it's pretty much the gang is back together. Everybody's returning except for, Anthony Tolliver, Josh Jackson, no offense to them, but guys that aren't considered parts of this core moving forward.
Sure. Sure.
The entire core has returned, and it's an opportunity for them to build upon the successes they had last year. The bubble certainly didn't go the way they wanted it to, but at the same time, they had a lot of success before the bubble. They made the play-in game because of that success, and that was valuable experience that should continue to pay off. As we got to remember, and I know Spurs fans can relate to this, both of these teams are in the midst of a rebuild. Maybe different stages, different processes to get there, but the rebuilds have begun. And Memphis has just been a little bit more lucky than San Antonio in terms of moving up in the lottery, and that's kind of the difference at this point.
Sure. And getting that second pick was instrumental to them really kicking off this rebuild. It really gave them that flexibility to move on from older guys,
Right.
really start a genuine rebuild. And that's kind of the difference between San Antonio and Memphis is you have a John Morant, you have seem to have that future franchise player that's going to potentially lead your franchise where you want it to go. And maybe the Spurs don't have that right now. I don't see that at least. I don't see somebody like that on their team right now. They're kind of in a weird transition period where they've got LaMarcus and DeMar leading this young core, so to speak. And
Right.
I don't know if someone emerges from these picks that they've had and they become this even borderline star. But I do like some of the young pieces that San Antonio has, but I really like a lot of the young pieces that the Memphis Grizzlies have. And I'm glad that you told me about Mario Hezonja. I actually had no idea that was the case with
Yeah.
him. But
Sure.
I saw that they added Desmond Bain, and he was
Yes.
one of my very favorite players in this draft. I scouted the entire class. I've been watching them for a long time, and he was one of these guys who I know we kind of devalue these upperclassmen, but he was
Right.
one of my very favorite players in this class. Is he someone who you think is going to play immediately, or is kind of like all the other rookies? This is a shortened, learning curve for them. They're going to have less time to learn the plays. They're going to have less time to adjust. Or do you think he really will get a chance to play from day one?
I love Desmond Bain too. He's I saw the review of him from Kevin O'Connor of The Ringer that compared him to Malcolm Brogdon. One of my favorite things about Bain is he's very self-aware. Um, you hear interviews about him and people ask him who he models his game after or who he thinks he can be like in terms of his style of play in the NBA. He doesn't say Russell Westbrook or, somebody off the wall that he's never going to be able to emulate. He says people like Joe Harris, he says Eric Gordon, he says good NBA players. Obviously, Joe Harris just got paid a phenomenal amount
Yeah.
of money. He says play, and Eric Gordon too. Eric Gordon makes 16 million a year, I believe. So those are two guys that, especially Gordon, maybe people look at and go, oh, Eric Gordon, is that your comp? Well, Eric Gordon's had a hell of an NBA career. Not everybody's going to be a superstar. Not every pick needs to be a superstar. Bain fits exactly what a running mate next to Ja needs to be in terms of a secondary facilitator and creator in the pick and roll, in terms of being somebody that has the opportunity to shoot the three at a high level. He was a 43% three-point shooter for his career at TCU. And you make the point about Bain being a 4-year player, an older prospect. Same thing was said of Brandon Clark, the previous draft. And one of the main reasons he fell was the fact that he was an older prospect. I had Clark at number 4 on my board. And, and obviously that manifested in a pretty successful rookie season, not just for Ja, but for Clark. And I think Bain is in a bit more of a logjam in the
Yeah.
backcourt than Brandon faced in the front court. I don't see him, supplanting Dylan Brooks. But there's another opening there in terms of a running mate, especially with Justice Winslow injured, that, a Kyle Anderson, DeAnthony Melton, who was re-signed, Grayson Allen had a successful bubble. Bain will be in the mix to get some competing time with those guys. It's hard to see him starting right away, but at the same time, his skill set matches up so nicely with what Ja needs to maximize his talents that I think he's going to get opportunity. But again, I think the most likely scenario is you see something along the lines of a, Dylan Brooks, Kyle Anderson, maybe Brandon Clark, but Clark struggled as a starter at times last year when he got that opportunity because Jaren Jackson Jr. is out too.
Yeah.
So they're going to have to try to find ways to fill those minutes. Ideally, Kyle Anderson's playing the 4 because I think that's where he's best right now. And then that gives you Dylan Brooks and maybe it's Grayson Allen, maybe it's DeAnthony Melton, and maybe it's Desmond Bain. I think there's a lot of competition on that wing, and that's a good thing. The iron sharpens iron concept can certainly be applied. They have lots of guys that are not superstars by any stretch of the imagination, not even stars, but
Yeah.
they're solid quality role players in the NBA that should fit nicely alongside Ja. The question is, how well do they amplify his talents? And then in the case of Bain, how well do they add to the skill sets of other players around them?
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people who didn't see Bain play a bit, like if you didn't see him play a lot, then you probably don't know that much about him because he wasn't one of the
Right.
big names in this class. But for me, he was the guy who was 15th on my board. I think he was one of the best non-point guard passers in the class. And when we talk about him shooting 43% from three in college, it wasn't just college range. He has legitimate NBA range. He can shoot it with a ton of consistency. I mean, he was, I think, 40% above 40% every year of his college career.
Yep.
So he's a guy who I really like for that team. And even if he doesn't play a lot, I do have confidence that he'll be able to carve out a role, which leads me to the next guy, Xavier Tillman. He was another one of those upperclassmen guys who actually may have been a sophomore, I believe,
Yeah.
or sophomore or junior, but he was another one of those guys who I really liked. I really liked him. I thought he could be a first round talent, definitely early second round. And we saw him come off the board. And I think that was a great pickup for the Memphis Grizzlies too. Now I'm going to ask you the same question: is he someone who you think can break into the rotation, or is he going to be maybe like an injury insurance kind of guy?
I think right away he'll be in the rotation because, again, Jaren Jackson Jr. is out, and he figures to be out probably for the first month of the season almost, according to Zach Kleiman, the GM of
Mm-hmm.
the Grizzlies. Um, I think in a perfect world, Tillman becomes the starting center when Jonas Valanciunas is gone, whether it's by trade in the next year or so. Valanciunas' contract expires the year after this one, so maybe they just let Jonas walk. We mentioned earlier being concerned about Brandon Clark as a starter. I saw enough of Brandon Clark, even in the small sample size, that I know even if he could become a better player as a starter, he is better suited to be a elite reserve player, like a Montrezl Harrell type. I
Yeah.
think he could be better than Montrezl Harrell because of the skill set he has. He's not as limited in several areas, especially defensively, as
Definitely.
Harrell is. But at the same time, I think you put Clark against longer, bigger guys that are just as athletic as him in the starting lineups, and a lot of what he's good at gets negated. So Xavier Tillman's a guy that can body down low. He's an excellent passer, a very good facilitator from the elbow. He reminds me of Marc Gasol in some ways
Yeah.
in terms of his passing. You could also, I mean, Draymond Green is another
Sure.
comparison that
Yeah.
feels lazy with the Michigan State stuff,
Sure.
but and Draymond Green was obviously a second round pick. So I think in a perfect world, Tillman eventually, I don't think right away, because you can make an argument Valanciunas is their third best player, especially offensively. But when Jonas is gone one way or another, instead of Clark sliding into the 4 and Jaren becoming a 5, I think we're getting more and more evidence that Jaren Jackson Jr., and again, positionless basketball and all the stuff that people talk about, as a traditional big, Xavier Tillman makes more sense in that spot than Jaren Jackson Jr. does. And I'm hopeful that we'll see evidence of that and he'll get a chance. Gorgie Deng is there as a trade chip, is my opinion, to
Yeah.
make salaries match if a superstar or something like that falls into their laps, or somebody else like Justice Winslow, obviously not a superstar, but that kind of trade, if it makes itself available to Memphis, that's why Gorgie Deng is there. I don't see him taking minutes from Tillman. Tillman, as a second round pick, signed a 4-year contract with the Grizzlies. He's definitely the guy they're investing in. And I think early on, like I said, it'll probably be, I'm hopeful it's Jonas and Kyle as the starters at the 4 and 5. And then you'll see a lot of Clark and a lot of Tillman coming off the bench.
Yeah, so you seem to like these guys who they drafted. Do you think
Absolutely.
overall that they drafted really well this year? Because if I had to give them a grade, I'd probably give them an A. An A plus, you have to have like the perfect draft, and I think they were almost perfect. I think they had an excellent draft. But what did you think about their draft this year?
Well, their perfect draft was the year before. They
Sure.
lucked into Ja Morant, and I think it's fair to say that. You know, you get the second pick. Maybe you think for a second about RJ Barrett, but then you realize Ja Morant's really good, and you take Ja Morant. And
Yeah.
that's what they did. But Brandon Clark, like I said, to me, he was the 4th best player in that draft. They trade up to get him at 21. The A plus was 2019. This was a solid A. It was a single or maybe doubles. It wasn't a home run like 2019 was, but that's okay, because if you believe that you're 2 stars, because again, Anthony Davis and LeBron with the Lakers, you know, Paul George and Kawhi with the Clippers, KD and Kyrie with Brooklyn, all these teams that are contenders have these 2-star players.
Mm-hmm.
If you believe you already have those 2 guys in Memphis and they're just 21 years old and they're not ready to be title contenders yet, you're not in an active search to try to bring those guys in. You're in the process of maximizing their talents, finding the role players that are going to be in a position to make them as good as they can be when they are ready to contend and be that next great Grizzlies team. And that's what Bane and Tillman are. You know, I think those are 2 guys that by the end of those rookie deals, you know, Memphis is going to be hoping to be a championship contender in 3 or 4 years. I think that's a realistic time window for them if their plan works. And, you know, those are going to be guys that are going to be in that spot to try to help the Grizzlies get over the top. And Bane is that creator and shooter. Tillman as that rebounder and passer. You know, they really kind of are the yin to Jaren and Ja's yang. And even if it's not as starters, they can still be contributors on that next great Grizzlies team. So they're not going to be superstars. They're not going to be stars. I don't see Tillman becoming Draymond Green and this Hall of Fame 2-way player, or especially defensively. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think those are guys that are going to be key pieces next to Jaren and Ja in the years to come. And that's all they need to be. Because again, if you believe and subscribe to the theory that Jaren and Ja are your stars, you're just waiting for them to mature and come of age in the NBA.
Definitely, definitely. And honestly, I've been looking at the moves. I'm a really big fan of the Grizzlies, and how they've been able to build this roster kind of quickly with a lot of really young, good, like quality talent players. And even their undrafted free agent signings, like I know that they brought aboard John Tay Porter last year, but now he has an NBA contract.
Right.
And they have Killian Tilly, who was a guy for me, easily a first round talent, maybe a lottery talent if he's able to stay healthy. He probably leaves before his senior year at Gonzaga. Right. So now you have these 2 guys, one of them's on a 2-way, one of them's on an NBA contract. I think those are 2 excellent complementary pieces as well that can also kind of seamlessly fit in with this Grizzlies young core. Do you like them? Are you high on them as well?
Jonte Porter, I'm not as high on. I do think that he could be really good. But you mentioned Killian Tilly. I feel like we've seen it more from Tilly as a two-way player coming into the NBA than we have from Jonte Porter because of the injury concerns. And I think if you're concerned about Tilly, you need to be really concerned about Porter. Memphis signed Porter to a 4-year contract, lots of non-guaranteed money in there, smart of the organization to do that. But clearly they see something in Porter. And we had a writer, my associate editor, Parker Fleming, over at grizzlybearblues.com today. We recorded this on a Thursday. He talked about like kind of similar to the Sam Hinkie deals back in the day that you saw the 76ers do with Robert Covington and Jeremy Grant. You know, they're these players that become extremely good. You're making smart bets, calculated risks on these guys that maybe other people wouldn't make those kinds of deals, but the Grizzlies obviously see value in them and they're trying to invest in a smart way to protect themselves, but also be able to reap the benefits if those contracts and that money hits. So I like Porter. I like Tilly more. But I think Porter, if he shows he's healthy, I mean, you watch him play at Missouri, he has the range, he has the ability to pass. He's a similar in terms of a defensive versatility player, but his movement's going to be a question with the injuries he's had. We just need to see him play. You know, people complain about Justice Winslow and all the injuries he's had. We literally have no idea what Jonte Porter is as an NBA player. So I think one of the things I'm most excited about in preseason is hopefully getting to see Jonte play. And he's another guy that maybe, you know, Gorgui Dieng goes away, Jonas Valanciunas goes away in the next year or two. And if you've got Jaren Jackson Jr., Xavier Tillman, Jonte Porter, and Killian Tilly as your bigs, you know, that's NBA draft Twitter's
Yeah.
dream scenario right there in terms
Yeah.
of modern big men that can space the floor, that can facilitate, that can do a lot of different things. Two-way defensive players in the case of Jaren and Brandon. You know, there's a lot of potential there. And again, if Jonte Porter is your fifth big and he's healthy, that's a real value on that contract. So I like both of those guys. I think that it reinforces the Grizzlies front office having a type in terms of looking for talent and diamond in the rough kind of situations, prioritizing fit over potential and actual production in the case of Tilly over potential. Because there were guys out there that you could have signed to a two-way contract, you know, 18 or 19 years old, and
Yeah.
maybe they become stars or, you know, close to stars. Killian Tilly will likely never be that, but if he's healthy, like you mentioned, he's a lottery talent. Like that's not disputed. People have injury concerns, and that's why he fell where he fell. Uh, if you can have that guy in your system and sign him to a team controlled contract, and he becomes a, you know, a Myers Leonard, Kelly Olynyk type of player, you know, that holds amazing value. Those are two guys that have had good NBA careers. And, you know, I think that's within the realm of possibility for both of those dudes as long as they stay healthy, which is a big if.
It is a big if, but I think it definitely is worth taking a risk on it because to me, it's such a low risk, high reward scenario for them. And
Right.
like you said, they're not going to be, you know, all stars or superstars or any sort of star, but they could be very serviceable role players. They could potentially even be a starter at some point or a spot starter. I really like what they're getting out of those two guys. And we've talked about a lot of the other young guys. And you mentioned DeAnthony Melton. He's another guy who, you know, Twitter or NBA Twitter has kind of
Yeah.
fallen in love with. I also like him. I think he has a little ways to go on the offensive end, but I think on the defensive end, he kind of reminds me a little bit of DeJounte Murray and that ability to disrupt passing lanes, be a really good point of attack defender in the pick and roll. I think he's somebody who can be extremely valuable to this team, but I'm not sure. Like you said, it's kind of a crowded backcourt. Do you think he takes precedence over a lot of the other guys on the roster at that position at this point, or is he? I mean, they gave him money, so I have to
Right.
think that he's going to be a priority in 2020, 2021.
He is. He definitely is. I think he's in the mix to be that starter at the two. With again, if you have Justice out, you have Jaren out. You're trying to figure out where those guys fit. You know, Kyle Anderson at the four, Dylan at the three, and again, positionless basketball on the wing.
Yeah.
You know, I think Melton makes sense in that spot. You can make an argument for all of those guys. I think the guy that's happiest to see Tyus Jones come back from injury is DeAnthony Melton. If we learned anything in Memphis last year and Phoenix learned it in his rookie season, DeAnthony Melton's not a point guard. You know, he might be 6'2", and you might want him to be a point guard. That's not what he is. He's an Avery Bradley, and obviously Bradley has become more of a point guard later in his career, but he's a Bradley type in terms of being an undersized wing who's a secondary facilitator. But what D'Anthony does so well. We talked about Bane in his shooting. Dylan Brooks is a willing offensive weapon. Maybe he shoots too much, but he's a guy that, again, all these guys have things that they bring to the table that, theoretically speaking, fit really nicely next to Jaren and Ja. When it comes to Melton, it's his ability to play in transition. Whether it's in transition on defense or offense, on both sides of the floor, he's especially offensively almost elite at this stage, at the age of 22, as a transition offensive player. And obviously, Ja Morant, that's something you want to see as much as possible, is getting out and on the move and creating turnovers, getting easy buckets. Melton's really good at that. So he's an excellent team defender. I like the Murray comparison. I think that's fair because Murray obviously can play on the ball. He gave Ja trouble in their matchups last year at times. I think Melton is similar in that way. He's also a very good team defender, not just on ball, but off, in terms of defending at the rim. He's very good in terms of verticality. He defends shots well as a rim protector, surprisingly,
Yeah.
given that he's undersized, on driving guards and wings, guys that are cutting off screens. He sees things coming. He's a very high, heady, IQ'd basketball player. And that's another part of the type that this Grizzlies front office has. They want these guys that are film rats, that are gym rats, that engulf themselves in the game and really learn and play by a standard that they, develop over time. And Melton buys into that. So he's a great investment. I loved that contract. There were rumors out there about him being, I think Hollinger of The Athletic had him valued at $15 million, the most valuable shooting guard in this free agency class. I think that was a little bit too much because you need to have a jumper at this point in the NBA to be somewhat relevant. But at the same time, he is so young. Like, he's only 22 years old. He's now the highest paid member of that draft class because of the fact that, most guys in that boat aren't signing that kind of contract right now. He was just that good as a second round player. I'm excited about what he's going to be. I think he can develop that shot. You watch his form, you watch his free throw shooting percentages. There's nothing that suggests that he's not going to improve. And if he does get better to the level that Memphis hopes he does, that contract that some people are maybe scratching their heads at right now is going to be a bargain here in a year or two.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you there. And I think it's actually kind of similar. And I know I already threw out DeJounte Murray's name, but we saw him get that contract extension from San Antonio a year ago. And people were like, what are they doing? He hasn't really proven anything. He's not a double-digit scorer. Of course, he was the youngest all-defensive team member in, NBA history. But aside from that, he had been out with that ACL injury. And people are thinking, well, he's a non-shooter. He's not necessarily a point guard. I know San Antonio's kind of tried to make him into one, but I really still don't buy into that. He is a true facilitator, like a primary facilitator.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting when we talk about like shooting. So with DeJounte, he improved as a shooter. And I think people have really kind of underestimated his ability as a shooter. But I think with DeAnthony Melton, it's going to be important that at the very least that he's a standstill shooter, because there's definitely different types of shooter. You can be like a JJ Redick where you're coming off of pin downs, you're running off of screens. You can shoot off the dribble, off motion. And then there's guys who are just good catch and shoot guys. And I think that's still very, very valuable. And even if DeJounte never, develops that, or even if DeAnthony doesn't develop that, if they can just be standstill shooters and elite at that, then I think they can provide a lot of value because they are such good defenders. So I'm interested to see where both guys end up in the next couple of years, because I think there are some comparisons that can be drawn, to both of them. And then in terms of the rest of this team, so I know we've talked that Jaren Jackson Jr. is going to be out for at least the first month this season. Where do you think, or how rather, do you think that affects them in terms of where they finish in the Western Conference? And do you think this continuity from last year gives them a better shot to, make the playoffs, or even if they make the playoffs, make some noise in the playoffs this year?
I think realistically speaking, Memphis will be in the conversation for the play-in.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're doing the new play-in this year where there's the 9 and 10 seeds, and they'll go against the 7 and 8 seeds. And it'll be a similar structure to what the Grizzlies saw in the bubble against Portland on that Saturday game. I think it was August 15th. And that was, a historic game, not just for Memphis, but for the NBA. It was the first of its kind. I think the Grizzlies will be in that mix. It's hard for me to look at the Western Conference, see what Phoenix did, bringing in Chris Paul, Golden State, obviously returning to full strength. If you assume that OKC and Houston are going to fall out of the top 8, well, there's the two teams that are replacing them, right? So you obviously still have Portland, who's going to be in that playoff mix.
Sure.
You've got New Orleans, the league darlings, who people figure will be in that mix. You have Sacramento, who figures to be in that mix. Uh, Minnesota's not interested in being a bad team. They're going to try to be as good as possible. In reality, the Spurs and OKC are two of the teams that maybe aren't rushing the process, but you have Greg Popovich in San Antonio. DeMar DeRozan is a very good basketball player still. LaMarcus Aldridge is a very good basketball player still. We talked about Murray earlier. I mean, San Antonio has talent too. So there's not really going to be anybody in the league who is just going to be outright god awful, I don't think, at least in the Western Conference. And when you're in that boat and you're looking around and you see so much competition and so many people that are going to do their very best to push for that play-in, between the play-in and the fact that the lottery odds have been flattened, Memphis and New Orleans being great examples of that in 2019, between those two things, people aren't trying to tank as much, at least
Yeah.
not that I can see. The value isn't there as much anymore. You might as well be competitive, try to make the playoffs. If you don't make the playoffs as a play-in team, you're a lottery team still, and you have those pick odds that help you. So I think Memphis understands their lot in terms of waiting out the development of Morant and Jackson. Justice Winslow should be back in theory. Again, just going kind of reading the tea leaves of Zach Kleiman, in the next week or two, or not, excuse me, in the first week or two of the season, Justice Winslow should be back or close to back. Jaren will probably be around a month. Kleiman said if the season started later, as it was originally rumored to be around Martin Luther King Day, maybe both those guys are back. But obviously that didn't happen. And because of that, the Grizzlies will start their season a little bit later. Or excuse me, those two guys will start their season a little bit later. I'm intrigued by what they're going to try to do. I think that John Morant's going to have a hot start. I think he's going to be aggressive as a scorer. I think that you're going to see a lot of Jonas Valanciunas early, a lot of passing from him. Essentially what they did in the bubble, because it's a similar circumstance, is what you're going to see coming out of the gate. And they're not going to have to play all elite bubble teams. They're not going to have to play
Yeah.
all these good playoff teams, the murderers row that they fairly had to play because the Grizzlies schedule was going to be rough. If the season hadn't been suspended. So I'm not complaining about that, but they're not going to get that in that first month of the season. They're going to have some Detroits. They're going to have some Charlottes. No disrespect to Gordon Hayward, but
Sure.
I don't necessarily worry too much about that. They're going to get teams of that ilk, and they're going to knock some of those guys off, and they'll be hovering around, 5 and 6, that kind of mix. And that's going to put them right in that 9 and 10 seed conversation as Justice and Jaren get back into the fold. So I think the play-in is a very realistic goal for them. I don't know that they'll achieve it. It's possible that they cool off a little bit. And even though they might be better than they were last year, they're still a lottery team. And to be honest with you, that might be in the best interest of the Grizzlies because, again, they're in the lottery. Imagine if Memphis won the lottery and got Cade Cunningham. And now you have John Morant, Cade Cunningham, and Jaren Jackson Jr. for the next 5+ years growing together with the Grizzlies. That's a title contender, like legitimately,
Yeah.
in a couple years down the road. So, and that's not a bad result for them. And it's not a bad result if they make the playoffs because that means that the team that you have in place is a competitive one and you're doing the right things in terms of development and growing that roster organically. So the beautiful thing about what Zach Kleiman and his front office have done is you can literally in Memphis cheer for anything. San Antonio's in a similar boat. They have gobs of cap space in 2021 summer. Like if Giannis didn't sign the Supermax, like the fear of Giannis going to play with Pop in San Antonio is real for me, at least. I know it may not be probable, but that sends a shiver down my spine. And they're going to have money to compete for people.
Yeah.
If Giannis leaves and goes to Miami or Toronto, OG Anunoby, Duncan Robinson, they can throw money at these restricted
Yeah.
free agents. So the Spurs are in a similar boat to Memphis in that if San Antonio magically is a playoff team, or not, maybe magically is the wrong word, but improbably is a playoff team, then awesome. That's great. If they're not a playoff team, cool. We're in the lottery and we have a chance to add more young talent and we have all this free agency cap space. Both teams are in pretty good spots. They may not be as competitive in the here and now as a Dallas or as even a New Orleans or a Houston, But at the same time, they're set up nicely to, as those teams age out, maybe not Dallas so much, but as Houston ages out, as the Lakers and the Clippers age out, as the Warriors age out, the middle to end of this decade is set up pretty sharply for San Antonio and Memphis and New Orleans and teams like that to really compete at a high level.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. The only thing I would say that I may disagree with you a little bit is I think San Antonio's position's a little different, just because with Memphis they obviously have their Ja Morant, they have Jaren Jackson Jr. And it's interesting. I actually threw up a poll on Twitter. I was just curious what Spurs fans were feeling. I said, would you be happier if they won the 2021 lottery or if they made the playoffs in 2021? And it was a 49-51% split with about 4,000 votes. And to me, if I'm the Spurs, I understand getting back to the playoffs is probably a priority. You have the oldest head coach in the league. He's nearing his last years of this, extension that he signed with the Spurs. And it's probably, that's it for him, right? That's probably it.
Probably.
And they owe it to him to at least try to be competitive. But at the same time,
no offense, hopefully. Fingers crossed. All due respect to one of the greatest coaches in history, but hopefully
I get what you're saying. And even like if he moves on, I think that allows like a new era of basketball to start in San Antonio. And I think what not a better time to have a top pick than in the 2021 or 2022 draft classes they're loaded. They're absolutely loaded. They have a ton of talent. I'm really in love with this draft class. I mean, even if you don't get a guy like Cade Cunningham at the first pick, you can have a guy like Brandon Boston. You can have someone like Evan Mobley, Jonathan Kuminga, Jalen Johnson. There's a ton of guys in this class who could be stars, all stars down the road. So I just think if you make the playoffs with the roster you have, it may not entice free agents to come, right? Because San Antonio has not ever really been a traditional free agency destination. We saw LaMarcus come when they had Kawhi and they still had the big three intact. So they were competing. But once LaMarcus and DeMarcus, this is the end of their contracts, right? They're on expiring deals. Once they're gone and you say, okay, well, we made the playoffs. These guys are gone. I don't know who wants to join that. Even if you're a Giannis, I'm not sure you want to join that team. So to me, it's like you make the playoffs, you're probably a first-round exit. You're probably someone else's entertainment. You're out in like 4 games, 5 games. I'd rather go compete really hard. Give the reins to the young guys. Let's see what they can do. Let's see what we have in them. And then if you make the lottery organically, you have a top talent to add to that, young mix that you already have. And I think you're better set up for the future. But I can see it both ways. I really could see it both ways. But I like where Memphis is positioned because I think you're absolutely right. For Memphis, at least, either scenario is a win for them. If they make the playoffs, that means they're good enough that they're ahead of schedule. If they don't, they can add a lottery level talent and a really stacked class. So I'm really excited to see what Memphis does in the next couple of years, because I think they're really set up to be a very competitive, even title competitive sort of team. And we're kind of wrapping things up now. So I want to get your feel for this division. So I'll give you my power rankings heading into next season for the Southwest Division. And then I'd like to hear what you have to say about that, what yours looks like, and then how you feel that the Grizzlies kind of stack up with the Spurs. So for me, it's going to be Dallas at 1, just because they have Luka. I think they just are clearly the number 1. Then for now, it's probably Houston. I don't know. They may blow it up. Then 3, the Pelicans. I like what they have, and plus they're healthy. They're healthy right now. Then 4, the Grizzlies. And then to me, San Antonio is pretty clearly number 5 there. But what do you think about that?
I would agree with that ranking. I think that Houston, like you said, is going to be interesting. Obviously, Christian Wood makes them interesting. John Wall makes them interesting after that trade. Who knows what Wall is going to be after a couple of years off here from injury. I think that you have to respect James Harden. He's one of the greatest offensive players in NBA history, so I'm okay with him at 2, but I agree that might fall pretty quickly. New Orleans is interesting because you have Bledsoe now. You have Lonzo Ball. You have, obviously, Ingram. You have Zion, and you have Steven Adams. So those are your starters. I'm struggling to see who's going to shoot the ball beyond Brandon Ingram from range. Like I'm curious to see how they make that roster work in terms of spacing. When the Grizzlies have more shooting in theory than you in their starting lineup, that's something to be concerned about. And I say that as a Grizzlies blogger. They're not the best shooting team in the world.
Sure.
And I just don't see New Orleans doing a lot offensively from 3 with that crew. So do they start somebody different? Do they bring Steven Adams off the bench, which doesn't make a ton of sense to me, but
Yeah.
maybe that's what they do. I'm curious to see how they play out. I'm not ready to crown them just yet. So maybe I would go Memphis 3, New Orleans 4. But again, a lot of it for the Grizzlies is health related. If they have Jaren and Justice, maybe you're more confident putting them in that 3 spot because you've seen them compete. But the experience of the play-in game was so valuable for that young team in Memphis because you were able to see when the chips were down, you're fighting for your literal life in terms of your team's season. Who's going to rise to the occasion? And I think that when John Morant gets 35 points and 8 assists with a broken thumb, essentially, you see that you've got, and I think that's a fair point you made about San Antonio not having that guy yet. Memphis has that dude. Like,
Yeah.
he's going to be pretty good. And to me, that guy has shown more consistently that he's ready to compete than a Zion Williamson. New Orleans has a lot more talent in the here and now, but I think that Memphis has someone who has that more of that experience. So if there's a play-in game between Memphis and New Orleans, when the chips are down, that team already has those moments ingrained in them and they're ready for it. Whereas New Orleans is going to be in a place where they're experiencing it for the first time, and maybe Ja can do to, those guys what McCollum and Lillard did to him in the bubble. I think San Antonio as the 5 makes sense. It's weird to say that, to be
Yeah.
honest with you. San Antonio is such a respected organization and franchise in the NBA. I think that they're going to be in a place to be in a top 10 pick in the lottery, and that's going to be valuable, because like you said, you don't have to get Cade Cunningham. There's legitimate opportunities in this draft. The 2020 draft was hyped as a bad one, and I disagree with that to an extent because it's not bad in terms of perspective. It comes down to your perspective.
Yeah.
Like Desmond Bane. Is Desmond Bane going to be the Johnson kid from Duke? Absolutely not. That kid is so much better in terms of his physical ability. But Bane is going to be someone who can have a good, long NBA career. And I think the difference between the 2020 class and the 2021 class is you have a lot more bites at the superstar apple. And if the Spurs are able to get those, those swings at the home run, in addition to the Murrays and all the guys that they already have in place, Lonnie Walker's a good player. If you're able to take that opportunity and continue to build that young core, you take that cap space, maybe acquire even more picks, taking on bad contracts, or you're able to bring in maybe not Giannis, but a couple of free agents that want to be a part of that Spurs culture. There's opportunity there for them to turn it around. But I think for this year, they'll compete. They've got those 2 veterans in DeRozan and Aldridge who are going to, they're not going to get embarrassed by any stretch. But I do think they're at a stage where they're going to exit the stage for a moment in terms of national relevance playoff wise.
Yeah.
And, they'll have to kind of hit the reset button here in this next year or two and go with a youth movement. So for me, it'd probably be Dallas, Houston tentatively.
Yeah.
And then you've got I'd go Memphis, New Orleans, San Antonio. But again, the 2 through 4 spots are up in the air right now. I could easily see Memphis being that 2 team and being in the 8 seed conversation in the West. I could see them also being the 4 and being closer to San Antonio than they are in New Orleans, if that makes sense. There's a lot of fluidity. I think Dallas is a pretty solid 1, and I think San Antonio is a pretty solid 5. And then the rest is kind of up in the air due to the uncertainty, especially in Houston.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really tight division. And I think San Antonio, like, I'm a little down on them right now, but after hearing what Greg Popovich had to say at his media availability and what some of the other players have had to say the last couple of days, it gives you a little bit of optimism if you're a Spurs fan. Like, Pop was saying that LaMarcus has bought into shooting more threes, expanding his range, which is something he already started last season, but they're going to need that now that Marco and Bren are gone, which Marco and Bren, losing them is addition by subtraction, in my opinion. Great shooters, but very one-dimensional and incredibly awful at the other end. Like, they're defensive liabilities. There's no nice way to put it. And I think that San Antonio may have a chance to just improve based off of that. And Pop also was talking about small ball. You were talking about positionless basketball. He seems to be buying into that concept a little bit more. He was saying, he's fine with playing 1 big and 4, wings or, perimeter oriented players. And I think that kind of behooves San Antonio in terms of trying to be competitive, because we saw them go to that style. And yes, they played some lower competition in the bubble. Guys were sitting starters, teams were sitting stars, but
Yeah.
I think I like what they had going there. The young guys showed a lot. And adding Devon Vasel, I know that, traditionally rookies don't play in San Antonio, but Devon Vasel, fifth guy on my big board, really
He's
high
good.
on him. I think he is one of the better shooters, at least right now, as a standstill three-point shooter. I think he's the best team defender in this class. And I
Agreed.
also think he has a little bit of self-creation potential. So I would like to see what he can do, even if it means losing at the end of the day. Like, I'd like to see what these young guys can do. But if they can buy into that small ball and they can replicate that success during the regular season, maybe they surprise. But again, I do think more likely we're going to see them very bottom of the division. And it is what it is. You can't be great forever. They had a 22-year run. It's pretty much unprecedented, at least in basketball. So I'm happy with that. I'm ready to see what's next for the Spurs. And I'm also excited to see what's next for the Grizzlies. So before I leave you, do you have any final thoughts about the Grizzlies or Spurs, or, anything? How about that you would like to, promote? Where can people find you on
Sure.
social media?
Well, the Spurs, we talked about the Grizzlies getting lucky with Ja Morant. I'll always point out that the one year that the Spurs are bad in those 22 years with David Robinson and all that, they luck into the number one pick and they get Tim Duncan, and the greatest power forward in history. So you guys have been lucky too. So we can share the luck. I really do enjoy the Spurs, the Pounding the Rock website. SB Nation does a great job with the team blogs, and I've always liked Pounding the Rock. I'm a fan of following other fans that are passionate about their teams, having the opportunity. I tell people to have the opportunity for this to be my hobby and to get paid for it. And, like, usually people are spending money on their hobbies.
Yeah.
People, pay me to do it. So it's something to be fortunate for. To have the SB Nation, platform is great. And it's cool to follow all the team blogs. So I really enjoy SB Nation's San Antonio blog. And over at grizzlybearblues.com, we're going to keep grinding. We never really took a break during all the craziness. And obviously, we had a lot of draft work, a lot of draft profiles. We're getting ready through training camp now and that sort of thing. So you can follow me on Twitter at Joe Mullinax. You can follow our blog on Twitter at SBN Grizzlies. And of course, check out grizzlybearblues.com. We have 4 podcasts on a podcast network. We do all sorts of stuff over at GBB. I have an awesome staff that I'm very proud of. And, hopefully you guys will come over and check us out as the season goes through.
Yeah, so check out their content over at Grizzly Bear Blues. SB Nation does a great job with all of their NBA coverage. And thank you again, Joe, for joining me for the second episode of the Southwest Division Preview Series. And Spurs fans, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that notification button if you want to know when the next video is dropping. And hit me in the comments. Let me know what you liked, what you want to see next time, and who you want to see on this channel going forward. But until next time, take care, y'all.